We have the CO2 equivalents. Now we're converting it to euro and dollars. And that just makes it quite easy for executive management to sort of run their forecasting, run their financial models, go into different scenarios and say, okay, if these are the decisions we need to make, now we know what we expect.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. I am Joachim from Greenifying Group, and today we have a great episode for you about the Sustainable Market Initiative, which is a group of very large pharmaceutical companies that have gone together to make their supply chains and other things sustainable. They just came out with a report that we are looking into. And if you like what you hear in the episode, please share it with a friend. We welcome all our listeners, and there's a lot of good episodes out there other than this one. Hope you will enjoy the show. Take care. Hello, Frederik. Welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast.
Thank you, Joachim.
How are you?
I am doing quite all right, thank you. It's the fall season in Copenhagen, so it's a little bit dark, it's a little bit moist, it's getting quite cold, so when you're outside you're always freezing or getting slightly depressed. But when you're at work, you're working on some really inspiring projects inside of Geek. So we have a lot of really exciting projects to decarbonize the healthcare sector going on right now, so that just makes it a joy to go to work and go out and feel like we're making a difference. So that part is quite rewarding. Darkness, cold, and humidity, not so rewarding. I'd say it's a net plus.
It's a shared feeling from my side, but winter is coming.
Winter is coming.
At some point, I always felt like it was also a pretty safe prediction. You're going to be right at one point. Without breaking any NDAs, could you share a little bit with our listeners some of the things that we're working on at a high level?
Yes. So one thing that's really exciting is a project to help with a vertical integration for an insurance provider that also provides insurance for health services and some of the care delivery places where patients go to get the delivery that's also covered by the insurance, and figure out how a sustainable take on that can help drive the business. So we can have more preventive measures introduced and also make sure that there's actually a direct business incentive to do more prevention, and that's really exciting and quite radical.
Definitely. That's aligning the incentives is one of the key barriers for preventive healthcare, definitely. And insurance is a really cool space, whereas in Denmark and many other healthcare systems, there you can basically only get paid to fix sick people that have already gone bad.
Basically the sick care regime, and I feel like this is actually sort of quite a subtle David in the David Goliath versus the sick care regime, but I feel like we're really sort of guiding David on that quest with this assignment, and it feels quite exciting. It's not a super large assignment and as such. It's probably going to be quite discreet. But I have that feeling that it's sort of the beginning of something bigger, and that's really cool.
Nice. And yeah, preventive healthcare always gets us excited. But today we're going to talk about something different. There's in general in the healthcare industry, there's these collaborations starting that the industry is banding together. We have the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition, we have Pistoia and other things where various industry players are trying to get together and pull together and align on how to do things and also probably de-risk themselves in the process. And there's a new initiative in place called the Sustainable Markets Initiative. What is the Sustainable Markets Initiative, Fred?
So first things first, it's what you could think of it as a group of the willing, and basically what they came together to do is to say, okay, it was formed in Davos, or Davis. I hear a lot of pronunciations on it, but at the World Economic Forum, with His Majesty King Charles now. But back in
still getting used to that.
Yeah, and it's actually a bit funny in the sort of decreed. It says that when he was still His Royal Highness, not the King, by that time, which I just find funny that it's like it's so formal. But it's a group of 7 companies: AstraZeneca, Roche, Samsung Biologics, GSK, Merck, Sanofi, and Novo Nordisk, that are all part of the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition, I believe, that came together to do the Sustainable Markets Initiative. And what's quite characteristic for this is that we're at the very top level, where it's the CEOs of the companies that are sort of leaning into this, to go to the COPs and say, you know,
the COPs like the COP27 that was just in Egypt,
and it was kind of launched at the COP26. So it was one of the, in my opinion, very few good things that came out of the COP26. That was overall quite disappointing. We did an episode on that that you can also listen to. But the overall notion here is that if there's no political willingness from national governments to push for keeping ourselves at a 1.5 Celsius global temperature rise, we as companies are going to do our utmost to stay on that trajectory. So that's, I think the term sort of, they call it a coalition of the willing. That I just find it quite inspirational and also quite needed, that someone sort of, you know, goes in with a large chest and say, this is the right thing to do. We also believe it's a great business opportunity to do it. And now we're doing it. And we're doing it despite all the riffraff going on in the national discussions. So that is just super cool. And the SMI then came out with this report, and that's why we're here. So the title of the report is Decarbonizing Healthcare Supply Chains. Amazing. Loving every bit of it. It's the recommendations on how to drive emission reductions across the healthcare supply chains, and that's what's needed. This is a very large part of what we do every single day. So it also, you know, it had kind of that feeling that there's an analysis of how you play football, but you play football every day, so it's kind of also feeling whilst you're reading it. But I think this was very much needed. It's really well structured. The too long didn't read. They come up with 9 levers to decarbonize the supply chain, and those are all quite functional tools, and they're scored at $1 cost for when should you move, what's the maturity of the solutions available in the space, and how fast can you get there. So overall, great piece of work, very, very great read. I read it whilst in the gym, which was amazing.
It resonates a lot with how we are working, and also what's lovely when you're working in the supply chain, when you sort of put that lens on, is that you sort of automatically get directed towards scope-free emissions, the emissions that are not from your own operations or the energy that you're buying, which is sort of the next frontier, but also just the like really hard key issue that we. It's not all scope-free in the report, but that always motivates me when we are discussing supply chains.
And you know, at the end of the day, one of the things that we often bring up when we're talking to clients, particularly in their R&D processes or in their sort of going to market strategy, and they need a sustainable business case, we often ask, okay, if you had to do this business case with a carbon tax, a global carbon tax, what would it look like? different sources disagree, but you know, overall, a 200 euro carbon tax per ton of CO2 seems to be sort of the
reasonable guideline.
A reasonable guideline that a lot of experts can agree on to be feasible. And for that reason, it's really interesting to me that the 9 levers are being scored in cost to implement per ton of CO2 reduced. And we have 3 high scores that are sort of listed at less than $30 per ton of CO2. And then we have a few more coming at the 30 to 120, sorry, it's euros, it's not dollars, 30 to 120 euro per ton, and then the more than 120 euro per ton to reduce. And I mean, that's just a great way to sort of say we have the CO2 equivalents, now we're converting it to euro and dollars, and that just makes it quite easy for executive management to sort of run their forecasting, run their financial models, go into different scenarios and say, okay, if these are the decisions we need to make, now we know what we expect.
Yeah. And even here we're only looking at positive. So all these solutions will cost dollars in removing the CO2, but less than the CO2 tax. And what I find really interesting as well, and a highly recommended exercise for anyone out there, is to do a marginal abatement cost. So just like they've set up here, like which initiative will cost which amount of dollars to reduce the CO2. And if you do that, what you'll find as well is that there's some projects, initiatives that will have a negative marginal abatement cost, where you will get money to remove CO2.
And that sounds like good business.
It is. It's sort of, and it's just that's the beautiful thing, that when you do that, and then marginal means you take, okay, so here we get $100 per ton of CO2 removed. Here we get $50 per ton of CO2 removed. Okay, here we pay $10 per ton of CO2, and here, okay, we pay $500 per ton. And it just makes it really easy to see. Okay, of course, $500 per ton of CO2 removed. Maybe that's not the one to go for, but okay, so this one we're actually getting money to remove CO2, then that's a no-brainer. Like, how are we not doing that? But there's still a lot of those initiatives that are not being done.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's we had in Denmark, we had a really interesting case where you had a very lucrative deal to install solar on your roofs as a citizen in Denmark for a very short period of time. And even with all of those incentives, very few people actually ended up doing it, even though there were a whole line of tax incentives lined up and you could almost get money to do it. And I think it's just interesting to have that reflection that companies are governed much like humans. They're not always rational. So there's...
It helps, but it's not enough.
There's an understanding that there's a lot of rational processes, but that just not result in all processes being logical, or sort of holistically rational, you could say.
But what are the top drivers here suggested in the report?
So the top 3 drivers are, of course, renewable power. We've known that. It's the usual suspect. It's available in the market, has very high degree of maturity and also a high degree of reliability. You can invest in setting up your own on-site renewable production if you are a major pharma company. Then we have process efficiency. If you get better at producing your product at a lower cost, both in dollars and CO2, it's good for business. Typically, there'll be a lot of areas to address. Of course, there's one disclaimer here for process efficiency, which is that the market is quite heavily regulated. So changing small things in your production side that would improve your efficiency may be subject to scrutiny from the regulatory bodies. So it could also sort of have a hidden cost, but the potential, if you're just looking at what's there, the potential should be there.
That's also where we see that depending on which team or unit you're sitting in, what kind of mandate you have over which process might be very different. Like, do you have control of the actual production line, or is just the surrounding facilities or the utilities? And what we see there is often that there's some great potential in speaking more together between the different areas of responsibility.
It's just the complexity unfolds with this one. So I think it's a curious choice to score it up there with renewable power that is highly commoditized.
So plug and play.
It's comparatively very easy to go out and do a power purchase agreement or build a renewable energy facility that can produce energy, compared to going into all of these tedious processes. Then the third one is product and packaging redesign, where you can reduce material and energy use. Arguably, I would say a lot of the things that count for process efficiency also counts here. So really, if I had to restructure this, I would say there's very clear number one, which is renewable energy, and then there's a number 2 and 3, and that distinction is not super clear, and I think that's a pity because it's quite well worked through. Then there's one thing I absolutely love, which is that they're giving voice to regenerative agriculture. So extrapolating on a lot of figures here, it can be assumed that 0.5% of all global CO2 emissions come from...
Across all industries, societies.
Global CO2 emissions. 0.5% of all global emissions come directly from the agricultural input to the pharmaceutical and healthcare sector. And that, to me, that's extraordinary because I'm a regenerative agriculture nerd. So I've been looking for an excuse to dive into this for a while.
No, it's amazing. What kind of input is that agricultural input to the pharmaceutical sector? That seems very abstract and academic.
I'm not sure where that category starts and stops. So that's the first disclaimer, that I don't know if the cantinas are inside or outside of scope here. But a significant portion comes from the feedstock for biologics. So when you do precision fermentation, you need some sugar. And you'll get that from different plants where you're refining the sugar and then you use that sugar as a feedstock for the fermentation process.
And the fermentation, precision fermentation, is a way of producing drugs, APIs, for instance.
Yeah, the long story short, if you want to produce alcohol, you use fermentation to produce this compound that we call alcohol. But you can also manipulate yeast to produce different chemical compounds. Insulin is one that we produce. Novo Nordisk does a lot of that. And that's through a precision fermentation process. And of course, it's sort of a live process that's opposed to the chemical production process that you have in traditional API. This one is quite a lot more difficult to control and to master, but it also carries significantly reduced impact to the environment, sort of holistic environment, not necessarily in greenhouse gas emissions. So the feedstock for biologics production would be a major concern here.
Yeah, especially also that we see biologics being on the rise.
Yes.
So it's not only a big issue now, but it's also one that, it's growing. Yeah.
The interesting thing is that regenerative agriculture does have proven business models. Yeah. And we're
what is regenerative agriculture?
So for agriculture to be considered regenerative, there's a bunch of different definitions going around, but I would say as a rule of thumb, it has to sequester more carbon than is expended in the system. So you have to bind more CO2 equivalents in the soil than you spend on harvesting the produce from the soil. So an example could be you have a field and you use that field to grow let's say corn. Once the corn is harvested, what you would normally do is you would chop down all of the corn, you would take all of the plant material, you would use it for something, but then you would have the field barren. There would be nothing there. What you would do in regenerative agriculture is you would have what you call a cover crop. So you could have, for instance, clover that would cover the field. So once you remove the corn, you would have clover there that is also binding nitrogen from the air. reducing the need for synthetic fertilizer or animal-based fertilizer, and also protecting the soil against the water evaporating through exposure to sun. So if you have a very dark soil lying around, it attracts the sun in a different way. It's not covered, it's not shaded by the plant cover. So that makes the water in the soil evaporate. And that then again spurs a need for irrigation. It spurs a need for further fertilization, further plowing, further tilling, etc. So long story short, regenerative agriculture binds more carbon into the soil than it spends on producing the produce.
Yeah, you get more than what you give.
You could say so.
Yeah, very cool. And it's also it's also relevant for the extraction compounds. Like sometimes, for instance, rosemary or other various plants where you will grow them, and then there's a specific molecule or something in them, and then you will naturally, the way that is grown has a very different impact, and it's just the fact that there is an agricultural input resonates a lot, because we know from the that if there's agriculture, there's probably something that needs to be fixed, because we know on the global large scale, agriculture and our way of eating is a very close second to energy in terms of where our food reduction, CO2 reduction needs to come from.
It's definitely one of the sinners, and we did two episodes here in the Sustainable Healthcare podcast on regenerative agriculture with coffee as the case in point through Sebastian from Slow.
That's right.
So that I would warmly recommend giving a listen if you're curious about the business modeling behind regenerative agriculture in practice. Their case is one of the most convincing ones I've seen. So something I absolutely hate about the report is that carbon capture and storage is ranked side by side with my love child, regenerative agriculture. And I think that's extremely unjust. Because regenerative agriculture...
Just because you personally like agriculture. But,
I mean, maybe I'm sitting here in a regenerative agriculture team shirt and analyzing the game, but I'm just feeling like regenerative agriculture is a very natural process, and that's the way we have done agriculture until we had fossil fuel-based agriculture. So it has
even more. We have the proven business models,
and it has 50,000 years of traction. So it's quite proven that this works. It functions. We know how it works as well. It has proven businesses that are making money, that are competing in the market right now, today, and have strong proven traction. Carbon capture, storage and utilization, however, has incredibly sparse traction. And I think it comes off, frankly, to put it in layman terms, to me it comes off as a bit of a joke that it's in there, because it doesn't really exist.
Especially the carbon capture. I mean, it's also a bit of an umbrella, and storage is a lot of different things, depending a lot on the scale. There are some storage things that work, but carbon capture is sort of it's a bit in the offsetting category, not done right for me as well. That this is sort of it has a high risk at least of being, let's not fix the problems, let's just
the problem
wait for something magical to happen.
The major problem is that it doesn't quite exist yet.
Yeah.
And of course, when we have a burning house, we do not want to extinguish the fire with a fire extinguisher that doesn't exist, but that someone has made a drawing of and tried to build a couple of times without succeeding. I would not want that fire extinguisher to help me put out the fire in my house, and that's sort of this is how. I mean, it does sound a bit strict, but I think it's mind-boggling that you have the major organizations that are working on carbon capture, storage and utilization are fossil industry companies. And if they were able to do what they claim they will be able to do at the cost they're able to do it at, it doesn't make any sense that they're fighting a carbon tax with their lobby muscle, with the other hand, because then the carbon tax would be the business opportunity of the millennium, not just the century. It would literally be the biggest business case ever if they were able to produce it at that cost that they claim that they are. So of course, to me, that is extremely smelly, and that's a huge point deduction for me in this piece of work, that we allow for something that is so fairy tale-like to have a place in a report that also has something that's so real, like PPAs, power purchasing agreements, and renewable electricity production capacity.
Yeah. And it's sort of in the same list, and
it's
not even at the bottom of the list.
No, it's kind of like who would you like to date? Superman, Bruce Willis, or your wife? You know, it's kind of, but Superman doesn't exist. Why is he in the list even? It doesn't make any sense. And to me that comes off.
Yeah, and now
I'm still sitting in the regenerative agriculture T-shirt. I recognize that, but it just it gets me a bit worked up. Let's move to the next thing that I do really like. One thing that that happens quite often in the universe is that things. Exchange of energy happens anywhere in the universe, and one of the byproducts is heat. That means that heat is a very available resource because of the way our universe is working. So the laws of thermodynamics shows us that heat should be the most easy thing to do. However, it also has this tendency to kind of disperse quite fast. So heat is easy, but it's not untricky. And therefore, I really will avoid a few points back after the CCS and CCU debate to the separation of low to mid temperature heat and high temperature heat, which are two very different beasts. So if you need heat above 450 degrees Celsius, it's going to demand quite a lot more energy. So it means that you cannot as easily use, for instance, solar cells or solar technology to produce that kind of heat. You are probably going to be reliant on combustion of some kind of fuel to get there.
And we see that in very practical terms on factory sites with pharma clients and others around the globe, that even to a degree where it's like, with one hand they might be like, okay, now we've gone totally green on power, and it's all renewable, and then it's actually on the electricity side, because it can be quite tricky to fix the steam things. Doesn't mean it can be done, and then we are getting further in concentrated solar power and combining with storage and other units. But it's
we're definitely approaching a territory where, in the sort of net zero debate, one of our positions in Green Innovation Group is that net zero only makes sense if everybody is net zero. And that's kind of the beyond net zero is, of course, that we as a global society do what's most meaningful. And when we're looking into alternatives to renewable electricity and renewable energy production, you could argue that at a global level, there's still such a grand need for renewable electricity production that maybe we would be better off investing our resources there and helping other industries with less financial means than installing heavy-duty steam production plants or something at a very high capex cost at a relatively low CO2 gain. But at the end of the day, I think what's also interesting, and the counterpoint to that, is that in driving the rollout and the deployment of new technologies in this innovation,
you're also helping move the price down, and
someone has to move first.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely a spot for the first movers also in the narrative that will come, and we can also just see that, you know, in biologics, being a market leader, going from the different elements of production into the extreme level of competency and precision fermentation that an actor like Novo Nordisk has had in the market has been quite a great market opportunity for them. Even though I'm sure someone has argued back in the day, you know, this precision fermentation thing, is it really going to be a thing? And because they've been looking at quite heavy capex investments at the time. So we could be in a similar situation now where, you know, the way that you will be independent from, for instance, conflicts between nations like we have right now, where gas prices are going completely bonkers due to the Ukraine-Russian conflict. You know, wouldn't you rather be independent and have a more resilient supply chain? I suppose you would.
And there's some really interesting cases at the moment where power purchase agreements and investments in renewable energy were done by corporates a couple of years ago out of sort of, yeah, it's also probably the right thing to do, all right, we'll do it, really, then, which are just like, was fine business cases back then, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. And I think that's important to keep in mind. But are crazy good business cases now, just because suddenly the energy environment looks so different. Frederik, where can people find a report? And if you had to give a key takeaway from your side, what would that be?
If you Google SMI, decarbonizing healthcare supply chains, you will get it as the first hit. I think that's the easiest way. It's the Sustainable Market Initiative, SMI. The key takeaway, I mean, for me in the regenerative agriculture shirt, it's of course that there's a quantification of the impact of the agricultural input.
Cheering song, yeah.
Which is something we're just cheering on the stadium of regenerative agriculture, and that is super cool. Then another key takeaway is that renewable power is still king. I don't think that comes out.
If you haven't done that, just start there, move fast and hard.
I don't know how it becomes a number 3 in the list of 9. I mean, to me, it's an indisputable number 1. But I think it's because most of the companies in the coalition of the willing have already done most of what's there to do. So, you know, I think that's the reasoning behind it being there on the list. Then a second takeaway is that clean transport is very far away. It's a distant future. High temperature, renewable heat for high temperature is also quite far away. But renewable heat and steam at low to mid temperatures is quite achievable and also gaining traction and maturity in the market. So if I could say nothing else, renewable power is still king. Renewable heat for low and mid temperatures is attainable. Clean transport is very long distance away.
For me, I agree, that's some good point. For me, there's 2 things that I really like about this. One is that this is some of the largest players in the market, which will pave the way for others. And we can move faster if we collaborate. And it's one of the absolute joys of our work is also putting good people from different companies together in the same room. And the second thing is that this is coming at a CEO level, which just is incredibly important for creating the urgency and getting things to move as fast as we really need them to become. And now that also means that if the initiatives are not succeeding, now it's coming as a personal cost for the CEO, which I really, really like.
Yeah, and we have a king on board. I mean, let's
I'm still not used to that there's a king, but good for him. He just made it, and I guess that just shows hang in there. And at
definitely,
one point,
definitely. I mean, just imagine that they have to get the documents signed by the king before they can go. I mean, I think that's That's it's inducing respect.
Yeah,
I believe.
British king at that. All right. Thank you so much, Frederik.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening in. It's always nice to nerd, and really nice seeing this new initiative. If you are more curious about regenerative agriculture, look into the episodes with Slow that produce coffee in a regenerative way. They're a really good way of seeing how regenerative agriculture can work in practice. And as always, if you like what you heard, please share it with a friend. We love the work on sustainability that all of you are doing out there. So keep on trucking.